I think it's safe to say that change is on my agenda. Change for good. And I embrace that and I enjoy that change. I don't fear it. That's the bit that excites me.
The royal account books were wrong. The money had moved, and someone inside Camilla's closest circle knew exactly where it had gone. When William found out, he didn't just ask questions, he took control, and the crown would never look the same again. What was really being paid for? And how deep did the secret go? The ledger that changed everything. In the financial records of Sandringham estate, irregularities had begun to surface, and the figures did not add up, and someone had noticed. A small group of senior staff had been reviewing the estate accounts as part of what appeared to be a routine internal check, and what they found was anything but routine. Payments had been moving through the books in ways that were difficult to explain, and the amounts were not enormous on their own, but the pattern was impossible to ignore. Money was flowing outward, reportedly toward individuals connected to Queen Camilla's personal inner circle, and who had authorized those payments remained deeply unclear. Concerns were raised quietly at first, with senior administrators reportedly flagging the irregularities without fully understanding what they were looking at. Then something happened that made everyone pay closer attention because a senior accountant who had been closely involved with the Sandringham records suddenly disappeared from royal duties without explanation. No announcement was made, no reason was given, and one day the accountant was present and the next, gone. That disappearance changed everything. Within days, a team of emergency auditors arrived at Sandringham, and their presence was kept as discreet as possible, with no press releases and no public statements. But palace staff saw them coming and going at unusual hours, carrying files and working behind closed doors well into the evening, and the mood inside the estate shifted almost immediately. Staff who had spent years moving quietly through the grand corridors of Sandringham now spoke in lower voices, and something serious was happening, and almost everyone could feel it. This was not a simple bookkeeping mistake, and the auditors were not there to correct a spreadsheet error because something far more complicated had been buried inside those accounts, and now it was slowly beginning to rise to the surface. The question was no longer whether the numbers were wrong, and the question was who had made them that way, and how deep the trail of those payments truly went. William receives the files. The documents arrived quietly, without fanfare, without warning, and without any indication of just how seriously they would change everything that came next. Confidential financial records from the Sandringham audit had been delivered directly to Prince William, and the palace aides who handed them over reportedly watched his face carefully, waiting for a reaction that never quite came in the way they expected. William had assumed at first that this was a routine internal matter, the kind of administrative issue that surfaces occasionally inside large royal estates and gets resolved without ever reaching the public. But as he worked through the files, it became clear that this was something else entirely. Investigators had uncovered hidden consultancy fees buried inside the accounts, and the payment patterns were unusual, structured in ways that seemed deliberately designed to avoid easy detection, moving through layers of transactions that took trained financial eyes to properly untangle. The amounts varied, but the direction of the money was consistent, and that consistency told a story that no one inside the palace wanted to hear out loud. Several names appeared repeatedly throughout the records, and those names belonged to individuals sitting comfortably inside Queen Camilla's personal advisory circle, people who had been present at private meetings, involved in quiet decisions, and trusted with access that most palace figures never received. Whether those individuals had acted alone, or whether someone above them had known, remained an open question, but the paper trail was difficult to dismiss. What unsettled palace aides most was not William's anger, because there was no visible anger, and there were no raised voices, no dramatic reactions, and no immediate demands for answers. Instead, William grew very still, very focused, and very deliberate in the questions he began asking, and those around him would later describe that stillness as far more unsettling than fury would have been. A man who shouts can be managed, but a man who goes quiet and starts reading carefully is a man who has already decided something. William read the files thoroughly, asked for additional documentation, and requested that the investigation be expanded to examine related accounts and contracts connected to the same network of payments. He said very little beyond what was necessary, and the people in the room with him understood, without being told directly, that the situation had moved beyond accounting. This was no longer about correcting errors inside a spreadsheet, and it was no longer about protecting the reputation of an estate, because William had seen the names in those files, and now the names had become the problem. Sandringham falls, under lockdown. The orders came quickly, and they came firmly. And by the time most of the estate staff fully understood what was happening, the changes were already in place. Prince William had moved decisively after reviewing the financial documents, and the first sign that something serious was underway came when routine internal approvals and authorizations across Sandringham operations were quietly frozen, with staff being told that certain decisions would need to pass through additional oversight before moving forward, and that new procedures were being introduced with immediate effect. Nobody used the word lockdown openly, but that was precisely what it felt like. Lawyers arrived at the estate without prior announcement, and auditors who had already been working through the accounts returned with expanded briefs and additional personnel, and together they began occupying conference rooms and administrative spaces well into the late hours of the night, with lights burning in windows long after the rest of the estate had gone dark. Staff passing through the corridors would see unfamiliar faces carrying sealed folders, speaking in low voices, and stopping their conversations whenever anyone came too close. The atmosphere inside Sandringham shifted in ways that were difficult to describe, but impossible to miss. And those who had worked there for many years would later say that the estate felt different, that the familiar quiet confidence of the place had been replaced by something heavier, something watchful and uncertain, and that even the most experienced members of staff found themselves choosing their words carefully in ways they never had before. Rumors began moving through the lower levels of the household almost immediately, carried in whispered exchanges and careful glances. And the word that kept surfacing again and again was the same word that nobody in any official position would confirm or deny, and that word was seizure. Staff were saying, quietly and among themselves, that William had effectively seized control of Sandringham, that he had stepped in and taken the estate's operations into his own hands in a way that bypassed the usual channels entirely. Whether that description was technically accurate mattered less than the fact that it felt accurate to everyone inside those walls. The freeze on authorizations continued. The legal teams kept working, and William himself maintained the same careful, deliberate composure that had unsettled his aides from the moment he first opened the files. And that composure, more than anything else, confirmed to the people around him that he had a plan, that he was executing it methodically, and that he had no intention of stopping. Sandringham had always been a place of quiet royal power, but now it had become something else entirely, and everyone inside it could feel the difference. The monarchy faces another crisis. News travels fast inside royal circles, even when nobody is supposed to be talking, and within a relatively short period of time, word of the Sandringham investigation had begun moving quietly through the networks of insiders, advisors, and palace-connected figures who operate in the spaces between official announcements and public knowledge. Nobody confirmed anything openly, and no formal statement was issued. But the people who needed to know had already begun to understand the shape of what was happening, and the concern that spread through those conversations was not simply about Sandringham, and it was not simply about the payments, because the deeper fear was about something far larger and far more fragile. The reign of King Charles III had already navigated significant turbulence, and the years leading up to his coronation had been marked by public controversy, family rupture, and a sustained erosion of the kind of quiet confidence that monarchies depend upon to function without constant challenge. And now, at a moment when stability had seemed within reach, another storm was gathering from an unexpected direction. Palace insiders reportedly feared that a financial scandal touching figures close to Queen Camilla could do damage that went well beyond the individuals involved, because public trust in the monarchy had been tested repeatedly in recent years, and each new crisis left the institution slightly more exposed than it had been before, slightly more vulnerable to the question that Republicans and critics had always been ready to ask, which was whether the crown still deserved the loyalty and the silence it had historically expected from those around it. William reportedly made his position clear in private conversations during this period, telling those closest to him that protecting the institution had to matter more than protecting reputations, and that the monarchy could not afford to bury another scandal in the hope that it would quietly disappear, because that approach had failed before, and the cost of it failing again would be higher than anyone wanted to calculate. But not everyone agreed with that position, and the disagreement was significant because some of those closest to King Charles believed that William was moving too aggressively, that the investigation threatened to destabilize the reign at precisely the moment when it needed to project strength and continuity, and that family loyalty had to carry some weight even in the most difficult circumstances. The divide that had always existed between those who believed the monarchy survived through openness and those who believed it survived through control was widening again, and Sandringham had become the place where that divide was playing out in real time. Camilla's inner circle starts crumbling. The first sign that something was breaking apart came not with a dramatic announcement, but with a series of quiet absences that began accumulating in ways that were impossible to ignore. Several advisors connected to Queen Camilla had begun disappearing from public view, and the disappearances followed a pattern that felt deliberate rather than coincidental, because these were not people who typically stepped back from their roles without explanation, and their sudden withdrawal from scheduled appearances and palace-adjacent events sent a signal that those paying close attention could read clearly, even without any official confirmation of what was driving it. Meetings that had been arranged weeks in advance were quietly canceled, and appointments that appeared on official schedules were removed without explanation, and in each case the language used to describe these cancellations was vague and carefully worded, offering nothing that could be followed up or questioned directly. The people who had once moved confidently through the corridors of royal influence were now making themselves scarce, and the speed with which they had retreated suggested that they had been advised to do so. Longtime palace figures, who had maintained careful associations with Camilla's circle, began putting visible distance between themselves and the controversy, and the distancing was noted by observers who understood what it meant when experienced royal insiders started moving away from a particular orbit without being asked publicly to do so. It meant the situation was serious enough that proximity itself had become a liability. The British tabloids responded with the kind of intensity that royal scandals reliably produce, and speculation about corruption and secret financial influence spread rapidly across front pages and online platforms, with each new detail feeding a narrative that the palace was neither confirming nor effectively denying, and that silence, which had historically served the monarchy well in times of crisis, was this time being read as admission rather than discretion. The palace's refusal to publicly explain the payments became its own story, and journalists and commentators began constructing timelines and asking questions that palace communications teams were visibly struggling to answer without revealing more than they intended. And that struggle was itself a kind of confirmation that the payments were real and that the explanations were not yet ready to be made public. Camilla's inner circle had not simply crumbled under external pressure, and it had not collapsed because of anything that had been officially proven, but because the people inside it understood enough about what was coming to know that the safest move was to be somewhere else when it arrived, and so, one by one, they went. William's personal breaking point. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from a single moment of crisis, but from watching the same pattern repeat itself across years, and William had been watching that pattern for most of his life. He had grown up inside an institution that had taught him to value silence over transparency and discretion over accountability, and he had watched what that approach had cost the monarchy in ways that were deeply personal to him, because the most significant casualty of royal secrecy in his lifetime had not been a policy or a reputation, but his mother, and that fact had never fully left him regardless of how much time had passed, or how many public roles had come to define him since. The memories of Princess Diana and the machinery that had closed around her. The way the institution had chosen its own preservation over her well-being. The way silence had been weaponized in ways that caused damage far greater than honesty would ever have done. All of it sat heavily on William as the Sandringham investigation deepened and the familiar mechanisms of palace management began moving into place around yet another gathering crisis. He reportedly feared, in private conversations during this period, that royal secrecy was once again in the process of destroying exactly the public confidence it was designed to protect, and that the instinct to contain and control, rather than to confront and explain, was the same instinct that had driven so many previous crises deeper rather than resolving them, and that choosing containment now would simply delay a reckoning that would eventually arrive in a far more damaging form. Something shifted in William during this period, and those close to him described a man who had moved beyond frustration and beyond the kind of careful institutional loyalty that had shaped his public conduct for years, and towards something harder and more determined. A willingness to act in ways that would be uncomfortable for the people around him if that was what it took to prevent the monarchy from repeating the same mistakes in front of the same watching public that had already extended more forgiveness than could reasonably be expected. The investigation stopped being purely about financial irregularities at Sandringham, and it became, in William's mind, and in the minds of those working closely with him, something larger and more consequential, which was a battle over whether the monarchy would face what was inside those files honestly, or whether it would do what it had always done, which was to bury the problem and hope the ground held. William had decided it would not bury this one, and that decision changed everything that followed. Behind palace walls, the meetings were not announced and they did not appear on any official schedule, and the people who attended them understood without being told that what was said inside those rooms was not meant to travel beyond them, but the tension that filled those private gatherings was severe enough that traces of it began seeping outward regardless. Heated exchanges had reportedly broken out between senior royals and their closest advisors during this period, and the central fault line running through every one of those conversations was the same, which was whether William had the right to do what he was doing, and whether targeting the associates of Queen Camilla constituted a legitimate act of institutional protection or a dangerous overreach that threatened to fracture the family at its highest level. Those who believed William was overstepping made their case with a kind of urgency that reflected genuine alarm, arguing that the investigation had moved beyond its original financial scope and into territory that was politically and personally explosive, and that pursuing it with the aggression William was bringing to it risked causing institutional damage that would outlast whatever problem the payments themselves represented. Because the image of a future king moving openly against the current queen's inner circle was not a narrative the monarchy could easily recover from in the eyes of a public that was already watching closely. But others inside those same rooms argued the opposite just as forcefully, and their position was that William's actions were not only justified, but necessary, and that the alternative, which was to manage the situation quietly and protect the individuals connected to the payments, would eventually produce a far worse outcome if the full story reached the public through channels that the palace did not control, which in the current media environment was not an unlikely possibility, but a near certainty if the investigation was seen to have been suppressed. The tension between factions loyal to King Charles and those backing William's approach grew measurably during this period, and it manifested not in open confrontation, but in the subtler language of palace politics, in who attended which meetings, in which advisors were consulted, and which were quietly excluded, in the careful silences that fell when certain names were mentioned in mixed company, and in the accumulating sense that two different visions of how the monarchy should handle its most dangerous moments were pulling in opposite directions with Sandringham caught between them. The estate had always held the monarchy's private life carefully, but now it held something more volatile, which was a family in genuine conflict over its own future. Camilla faces isolation. She had not been formally accused of anything, and no official statement had connected her directly to the payments or to the decisions that had produced them, and the palace had been careful, publicly at least, to maintain a clear boundary between the investigation into her associates and any suggestion of personal wrongdoing on her part. But the boundary that existed on paper bore very little resemblance to the reality that Camilla was living through during this period. Her public appearances had become noticeably more controlled, and those around her had grown more careful about the environments she was placed in and the questions she might be exposed to, and the spontaneity that had occasionally characterized her public engagements in earlier years had been replaced by a tighter, more managed approach that reflected the awareness that any misstep, any unguarded moment, could become the detail that defined the next cycle of coverage. Media scrutiny had intensified around every member of her inner circle who remained visible, and journalists who had previously focused their attention elsewhere were now examining the backgrounds and histories of Camilla-connected figures with a thoroughness that produced a steady stream of new details, some significant and some circumstantial, but all of them feeding a narrative that grew larger and more damaging with each passing week. Insiders who had remained close enough to observe her during this period described a woman who felt genuinely abandoned by people she had trusted. And the sense of isolation was reportedly significant, not because Camilla was without support entirely, but because the specific people who had formed the inner architecture of her royal life, the advisors and allies and trusted figures who had helped her navigate the extraordinary transition from controversial outsider to queen consort, were no longer present in the ways they had been, and their absence left a visible gap. The question that circulated most persistently in private conversations was not whether Camilla had authorized the payments directly, but how much she had known about the financial arrangements that her associates had been involved in, and whether knowledge, even without direct instruction, carried its own form of responsibility that the investigation might eventually be forced to address. And that question, unanswered and unanswerable in public, settled over everything like a weight that showed no sign of lifting. The future king takes control. There comes a moment in every power struggle when the balance tips decisively in one direction, and those watching closely can feel it happen even before it becomes visible in any official way. And that moment arrived quietly but unmistakably as William began expanding his reach beyond Sandringham and into the broader architecture of royal financial operations. The oversight measures he had initially imposed on the estate were extended outward, methodically and without fanfare, touching key areas of royal administration that had previously operated with a degree of autonomy that few had ever thought to question, because questioning them had simply not been part of the culture, and the culture had always assumed that the people managing these operations were doing so with integrity that their proximity to the crown demanded. William was no longer making that assumption, and the withdrawal of it changed the atmosphere across multiple institutions simultaneously. Independent legal advisors were brought in quietly, without the internal consultation that would normally precede appointments of that significance, and their briefs were deliberately broad, covering not just the specific payment patterns that had triggered the original audit, but the wider network of contracts, consultancy arrangements, and financial relationships surrounding them, because William had decided that understanding the full picture mattered more than moving quickly, and that a partial investigation would produce partial answers that would eventually prove insufficient. Several contracts connected directly or indirectly to the network identified in the Sandringham files were suspended pending review, and the suspensions were handled with the same quiet efficiency that had characterized every step of William's response, with no public announcements and no dramatic gestures. Just a steady and systematic withdrawal of authorizations that sent a clear message to everyone paying attention inside the institution. Public opinion began shifting in ways that surprised some observers, because the image of William as a reform-minded future king, willing to hold the monarchy accountable in ways that previous generations had refused to consider, resonated with a public that had grown skeptical of royal institutions and hungry for evidence that someone inside them was capable of genuine accountability rather than managed transparency. The coverage was not uniformly positive, and voices argued that William's actions were constitutionally questionable and personally motivated, but the overall drift of public sentiment moved toward him, and that shift was not lost on the people inside the palace who had opposed his approach. The message he was sending through every suspension and every independent appointment and every frozen authorization was the same message delivered in different forms, which was that no one inside the monarchy, regardless of their title or their proximity to the crown, existed beyond the reach of accountability, and that the era of quiet burial was over. He was not doing this loudly, and he was not doing this for the cameras, and the people closest to him would later say that what distinguished this period was precisely the absence of performance, because William was not trying to be seen doing the right thing. He was simply doing it. And the difference between those two approaches was exactly what the public, exhausted by decades of royal theater, had been waiting to witness. The crown's most dangerous secret. The payments had been documented, the auditors had done their work, and the legal teams had built their files with careful thoroughness. But even as all of that was happening, something remained stubbornly out of reach, which was the full truth of what the payments had actually been for. Officially, very little had been confirmed, and the palace had maintained its position of carefully worded non-disclosure throughout the entire investigation, offering nothing that could be directly challenged and nothing that could be directly verified. And that strategy of managed silence had succeeded in keeping the most damaging specifics away from the public. But it had also filled the vacuum with speculation that grew larger and more damaging than confirmed facts might ever have been on their own. Theories circulated about the true nature of the financial arrangements, about what the consultancy fees had actually purchased, about whether the payments represented simple financial impropriety or something more deliberately constructed, and about whether the figures who had disappeared from public view had done so because they were guilty of something specific, or because they knew things that made their continued visibility dangerous to people above them. Sandringham itself had been transformed by everything that had happened inside and around it, and the estate that had historically represented private royal comfort had become a symbol of internal conflict and institutional fracture, a place where the gap between what the monarchy presented publicly and what it managed privately had become impossible to maintain in its usual form. William emerged from this period as a figure genuinely changed by what he had done, and those who had watched him closely described a man who was harder in ways that were difficult to articulate but easy to observe, more certain in his judgments, less patient with institutional habits that had historically governed how the monarchy handled its most uncomfortable truths, and more willing to accept the personal costs that came with choosing accountability over loyalty. The battle over Sandringham had revealed things about the monarchy that its most experienced defenders would have preferred to keep buried, and chief among those revelations was the fact that the financial arrangements uncovered in those accounts were not an isolated anomaly produced by a few rogue individuals, but something that raised deeper questions about the culture of financial management that had existed inside royal operations for a significant period of time. Whether those questions would ever receive complete and public answers remained genuinely uncertain, because the forces inside the monarchy that preferred silence were still present and still powerful, and William's actions, decisive as they had reformed the situation without fully resolving it, and the difference between reform and resolution was a gap that might take years to close. What was no longer uncertain was the nature of the man who would one day inherit the crown, because the Sandringham crisis had shown William as he actually was when the choices became genuinely difficult, and what it showed was a future king who had looked directly at the most dangerous secret inside his own family and decided that the monarchy's survival depended not on protecting it, but on facing it, and that decision, costly and uncomfortable as it had been, was perhaps the most significant thing to emerge from everything that Sandringham had become.